I don't know how much down in the trenches we're going to talk about, but I was sitting with some of the other speakers, and we got a little fidgety when Paul started talking about how the remainder of the speakers were going to make clear the exact and precise scientific nature of science. A couple of us kind of looked at each other and said, "Are you going to do that?" "No, I'm not going to do that." You know. So my purpose today is more to draw some parallels between Vipassana and some very general scientific principles. And the point of that is to show that while Vipassana is also an art, as Paul so beautifully demonstrated this morning, it has correlates in the natural world. And the idea behind that is that Vipassana is practical. It's about reality, and it's not esoteric or woo-woo. So what I'm going to be doing today is quite speculative. There's no real rigorous data about, the scientific benefits of Vipassana. Rather, I'm going to focus on how and why Vipassana works, the mechanism, so to speak. You'll have to do your own study, your own experiment by coming to a course if you want the exact scientific data. So let's start with a couple of definitions. Obviously, those of you that meditate are very familiar with the theory behind Vipassana as well as its practice. And some of you may have been introduced to that with the CFI video. But I think we'll just cover some very, very basic things about Vipassana so you have a grounding framework to incorporate some of the things we talk about. Vipassana, first of all, the literal meaning of the word is to see things as they really are. Loosely translated, it's insight. And I think of Vipassana as it's a rational, practical method of systematic self-observation. And in this process, we learn to explore cause and effect and change within the framework of the body. We learn to remain balanced and happy instead of reacting in pre-programmed and automatic ways that we become enslaved to under normal circumstances. As far as science goes, I think that, we could go on for a long time trying to define science, but I decided just to take the Webster's dictionary definition, which defines science as the study of natural phenomena in an orderly way, knowledge acquired through experience. Now, by this very broad definition, Vipassana is certainly in the spirit of scientific inquiry. And the focus in Vipassana, in one way of looking at it, is that it focuses around the mind-body connection. The idea is that all mental and physical phenomena manifest in some way at the sensation level. In other words, physical sensations on the body. And it's through sensation that you have a very tangible and concrete way to explore this cause and effect and change going on. So I don't know how many of you have that those 2 pages of swimming figures in your handout there, but we're going to refer to pictures in there throughout the talk as a way to relate visually to what we're talking about. And on the first page, there's just a little hierarchy of the sciences that shows the levels of science, some of the levels we're going to look at today. We'll just pull a few examples out of each of those. And they start with the basic sciences, physics and biology and chemistry, and move up through some of the medical sciences and psychology, and then at a more collective level, the social level. So let's talk about what are the parallels between Vipassana and science. And we'll focus on some of the basic principles of Vipassana and use that as our framework. So you might say, why bother learning Vipassana? Some people say, I'm perfectly happy. I have no need for a technique like this. Well, one of the fundamental principles of Vipassana is that suffering is universal and pervasive, that all beings suffer. And as Paul pointed out today, there's what I call big suffering, that I think John Moore or John Mueller, I can't remember his name exactly. What he experienced Some of these catastrophic, tragic types of suffering is what most people relate to when they hear suffering. But there's also the series of little suffering we go through every day. A friend of mine is fond of saying that life is a series of mishaps. You stub your toe, you get in a traffic jam, you confront the crabby bank teller, and all those day-to-day irritations are things that we're continually reacting to and generating tension to. And that creates more tension and creates a general sense of dissatisfaction. And the way we really define suffering in Vipassana is being dissatisfied with what is at any given moment. It's a very all-inclusive definition. One interesting aspect of suffering is the way we personalize suffering. It's the I in suffer that makes us suffer. Somebody else is suffering, while we may have a certain degree of empathy for that. It tends to fall under the general heading of things happen. And I'm sure that most of you know the saying, the smallest pain in my littlest finger concerns me more than all the suffering of the world. And certainly at times we're more compassionate than others, but that's often a tendency. And I know when I'm in the trenches, so to speak, and my pager goes off, the pager makes great suffering because it's my pager going off. Somebody else's pager doesn't do that. So it's the I in suffering that makes it what it is. So we'd say, what's our focus, what's our object in Vipassana? And the object in Vipassana, as I said, is sensation on the body. And this is what really much of the technique revolves around, really all the technique about objectivity with sensation on the body. And when we say sensation in Vipassana, we mean it in a very specific way. In psychology, about sensation and perception, they use sensation in terms of what we see, what we hear, what we taste, that's all sensation. In Vipassana, we mean it in a very narrow and specific way, and that is physical feeling on the body. And again, the idea being that this is the link between mind and body. This is the way in which we can directly observe what's going on at the level of the mind as well as the body. And we develop quite a keen sense of this. Your understanding of sensation becomes very subtle and very we have a much lower threshold than we would normally. And I think that Peter will probably talk a little bit more about the physiological basis of sensation and how it works. We won't go into that. Now, in terms of what we do with that, once we have sensation, once we've developed that awareness, we have to ask, what do we do with it? Well, we want to cultivate an attitude of objectivity and what Goenka calls equanimity. And this is certainly an English word, but we don't use it very much in our language. And if you look in Webster's, it talks about objective is actually existing, the real. The definition of equanimity is much richer than that, and they define it actually quite well in the dictionary. It's mental composure or evenness of temperament, especially in misfortune. So this is the fundamental pieces of Vipassana are around awareness of sensation and this equanimity, so we can short-circuit this reactive pattern that we get into that we aren't even aware of. Now, it's interesting in the sciences, there's a general assumption that we can't achieve that kind of objectivity. There's, to my knowledge, no exploration of that even. It's such an underlying assumption that human beings are incapable of that kind of self-observation in such a calm and objective way, non-judging. But Vipassana challenges that notion and allows you to actually practice with a very concrete tool like sensation. Now, again, I think Paul referred to this. Often we get a little nervous around this concept, like it's going to be about indifference, not reacting, flat affect. Another student was troubled when she took her first course. She said, I kind of get this feeling that equanimity is about when I don't like something, I put my hands over my ears and hum really loud so I won't know what's going on. But as people develop in equanimity, they learn that it's a very rich concept that involves aspects of trust and surrender and so on. So we have to ask ourselves, what's so important about sensation? Why sensation? And this is where we get into kind of the body of pieces in science that correlate with Vipassana. There are 6 reasons that I think we can break down into why sensation is important. The first reason is that it's experiential. It's something, you can't get anything more experiential than what you're actually feeling on your body at any given time. And in adult learning theory, for example, they repeatedly emphasize that experiential learning is the best. They say, I hear, I forget, I see, I remember, I do, I understand. And sensation grounds us at a level where we're actively engaged, we're actually doing. And certainly this is compatible with adult learning theory. The other way in which sensation is helpful is that it keeps us in the here and now. It keeps us in the present moment. And there's a tendency for the mind to wander in past and future, and we're missing what's going on at this level of cause, effect, and change in the body, this continual reaction. We're missing that if we're wandering in the past and the future. And sensation is a way of keeping us in the here and now. And also with the idea that now is the only thing we have any actual influence over. It also provides continuity. You can tune into sensation at any time. And certainly in the sciences, it's very clear in the biological and physiological sciences that sensation's going on all the time, perhaps not at the level that we mean it in Vipassana, but there's continual activity, and at any given time you can tune into sensation. It's going on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, better than satellite TV. So another aspect of sensation is that it makes the impermanent nature of our mind-body structure very apparent. Now, there's a number of examples we're going to go through in sciences that demonstrate this law of impermanence. And we'll start with atoms, which is at the level of physics. And if you look at your little list of figures, you can see figure 3 there. You've got a series of 3 panels with water molecules on it. And I'm just going to briefly take you through a little exercise that the famous physicist Feynman used to give to his first-year physics students to demonstrate this impermanent nature, starting right with the atomic level. In the first panel, you see molecules of water in the liquid state. And you've got an oxygen molecule, which is a big blob, and a couple of hydrogen molecules. Now, the nature of atoms is that they have an attractive force. They're electrical in a sense, so they attract one another. They also are continually interacting and bouncing off of one another. And he talks about how there's always a certain amount of heat in any set of molecules, and that heat gives energy and translates into motion. So these molecules are all moving around and bouncing off of each other and bouncing off the walls. Then if you increase the heat in the system, it becomes steam. The molecules fly apart because there's more energy in the system. The molecules are jiggling and wiggling at a higher velocity, and that overcomes the attractive force between them, so they fly apart and become steam. Then he says if you go in the opposite direction and reduce the temperature, of course, you have water solidifying into ice. It's a good demonstration of how something that looks very, very static and very solid is not at all. These atoms are certainly moving at a much smaller rate. They're vibrating in place, so to speak, but the movement is very, very small. So even in something like ice that looks very solid and static, there's still a certain amount of movement and oscillation, vibration going on. So one of the interesting things about this is the Buddha 2,500 years ago talked about kalapas. Now, kalapas are what he called, our nearest translation is subatomic particles. And this was a man who obviously didn't have any scientific instruments, only his own experience observing sensation. And he defined a kalapa as the smallest indivisible unit of matter. It can't be divided any further. And he said that within each kalapa are 8 components. And those 8 components consist of earth, air, fire, and water, and their characteristics of those elements. Now, this all sounds very esoteric, but what's interesting to note is if you get further into the explanation of what is earth, air, fire, and water, it's very much in line with some of the forces that act in nature. For example, earth element is mass. Now, obviously, a drop of water sitting there has a certain mass, though it may be very small. And water element is certainly the nature of fluidity, which water has, but the water element is also responsible for binding or cohesion. So this attractive force that these molecules feel for one another and that they respond to is all about cohesion. Then he talks about fire element. Fire element is the whole range of temperature from the coldest to the hottest. And when he talks about adding heat to a system like a glass of water, that translates as energy, and it changes that the molecules start to vibrate much faster. And that translates into motion. So air element is the quality of movement and motion. Now, you can see that there's an infinite array of possibilities when you take a kalapa and you start to incorporate varying degrees of intensity of each of these elements within each kalapa. Then you get a large variety of the ways that the kalapas that make up these particles can interact with each other and act in the world. That's a very interesting piece of theory of Vipassana that very much correlates with physics. Then we can talk about matter and energy. And through the sciences, particularly physics, we can see that essentially matter and energy are one and the same. They're interchangeable. And Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared, was kind of, I think, the first thing to really make that relationship apparent, and it was quite revolutionary. I remember in my first year of physics, physics, in all honesty, didn't interest me very much. It was not my forte, but I really perked up when my physics professor said, human beings are nothing but sinusoidal oscillations of electromagnetic radiation. Whoa, that's heavy, And it caught my interest, and it's very true, that matter has an electrical component, and all of these particles and up to the level of organisms have an electromagnetic field, an electrical field. What's interesting about that is it's, again, part of the whole aspect of impermanence and continual oscillating and changing and vibrating. Energy has wave characteristics, and waves travel, and they oscillate and they vibrate. So it also opens up the possibility of how we're all interconnected, and how what's going on in my electromagnetic field is going to have a certain oscillatory frequency, and that in theory that should affect the world around me, whether the objects are inanimate or other people. So it's an interesting concept to explore. And one of the other figures on this diagram is figure 4, which shows essentially what they call in physics wave-particle duality. And they have a little simple picture of a particle and a wave. And what's interesting is when they started doing experiments with electrons, one of these particles, they found that if they shot an electron through a board essentially with some slits in it, that when they measured what came out on the other side, the electron, which they thought of as a particle, like a little billiard ball, had gone through more than one slit at the same time. And they said, this is not possible. You can't have a particle going through 2 slits at the same time. So they investigated that some more and figured, well, I guess the only explanation is that the electron also has wave characteristics, because we know that waves have that capacity to pass through larger areas, almost like a flashlight beam. So they realized that an electron, which is a fundamental unit of matter, something we think of as solid, has also this wave or frequency characteristic, which is energetic, and also brings in this possibility of vibration and frequency and oscillation. There's another little figure on here, figure 6. That's a very interesting, very direct, shows a direct relationship between matter and energy, and they apparently accidentally discovered this when they, in cloud chambers in their physics experiments, that when a high-energy photon, which is light, essentially, an energetic phenomenon, passes in the vicinity of a heavy nucleus in an atom, it splits into an electron and a positron. And those are particles. Those are matter. So the relationship is direct between energy and matter, and this particular little experiment shows that. Don't try this at home, kids. No. I'm not suggesting for a minute that when you meditate you're going to be splitting photons into electrons and positrons, but at least not intentionally. But it's merely to demonstrate a point. And again, I've just given you a table of particles and particle physics that you'll be quizzed on in the question and answer period, just to show where they've come in terms of particle physics and all these different particles that would be interesting, again, to explore what kalapas, the theory behind kalapas, has to do with particle physics. So the next level is, we can go up a level and talk about biochemistry, and you see on your diagram there that there's a Krebs cycle, otherwise known as the respiratory cycle. This is a biochemical cycle, a series of chemical reactions that go on in cells in the body to generate energy for use in other biochemical cycles. So this is a very complex system where all these different cycles are interacting with one another to drive physiological processes. And it's interesting that the Krebs cycle probably makes up less than 1% of what we know about biochemical cycles and reactions in the body. And as you can see, there's a lot of complicated formulas, but what they essentially are groups of molecules, which are made up of atoms. And again, so they inherently have this oscillating, vibrating quality that atoms have. And then we can move up to the level of the cell, and if you turn your sheet over, you just see a little picture of a cell, which will be very familiar to many of you. And it's essentially a little factory where all these different components, all of which are made up of atoms and molecules, all doing their thing and jiggling and wiggling, are all interacting in a way to drive this machinery in a very organized, purposeful way, which then goes on to cells make up tissues and organs, and then the level of the whole organism. And remembering again this wave particle duality, the matter and energy nature of matter. And there's a little picture of a salamander here, figure 10, and that's just to show you that that there is indeed a demonstrable electrical field around a living organism. Another meditator was looking at this, and she kind of looked at me blankly and said, "So, tell me again, what do salamanders have to do with enlightenment?" Oh, permit me this little digression. Well, I think the reason this impermanence is so important is when you feel this going on at the sensation level, and I want to make clear here that this is the part that's not anywhere to be found in science, that all of this activity going on translates into sensation. That's something that we notice in Vipassana, and that is a fundamental assumption of Vipassana, but that has not certainly been proven in science by any means. But I think we start to understand how when we feel this constant change going on, that we're powerless to stop it. And when you realize that at an experiential level, you stop resisting and you learn to embrace and flow with that kind of change, so that when things are going on in your life, you can be much more balanced and just flow with that and stop resisting. What's another important aspect of sensation? Another important aspect that we've already alluded to is it's a connection between mind and body. It's the final common pathway for all sensory and mental input into the mind-body structure. In a sense, it's quite comprehensive and all-inclusive. So, in the scientific literature, certainly, I don't think this question has even been posed. Could sensation actually be, a final common pathway, an all-inclusive endpoint for all of this phenomena going on, whether it's thought, and we'll get into how thought might relate to physical goings-on. But this is a very big assumption, and it would be very interesting to explore this at a scientific level. Be a big job. But what's interesting is there's a huge body of evidence in the sciences that mind and body are connected. So we could go on for hours talking about that, but I'll just pick a few examples out for those of you who haven't delved into some of that literature. there's a few figures here that show figure 11 and figure 12 and figure 13 are all about neurotransmitters, which are like messenger chemicals that were normally thought in the past to occur only in the brain. They have a lot to do, some of them have a lot to do with mood and emotion, so on, and how they interact with these receptors, which are in the membranes of cells, and that transduces into a message to the cell to do something differently, and how that all cascades down to affect the activity of the cell and ultimately the whole organism. And then there's just a little picture of a synapse of a neuron, the way nerves communicate with each other by sending these little neurotransmitters across this gap we call a synapse, and they bind to the receptors and then do their thing. And the table is some examples of neurotransmitters. What was interesting is Candace Burt did some interesting work. For those of you that aren't familiar with her, she and some of her colleagues discovered the opiate receptor back in the 70s. And some of you may not be particularly enamored with opiate receptors, but this was a big deal at the time. And what was found more recently through her work, as well as others, that really stunned the scientific community was that these receptors were not only going on in the brain, that every cell in the body, every tissue in the body had receptors for neurotransmitters. Now that really threw people, because what it was essentially saying is mind is everywhere in the body. That these neurotransmitters that are going on as a result of all these mental states and mental activity are essentially traveling throughout the body and binding with receptors on every tissue in the body, and they're causing the cell to do its thing. And they've demonstrated receptors on immune cells even, so there's a direct link between the nervous system and the immune system, and there are endless examples of that. And people had to really rethink this whole concept, and it forms what Candace Burt refers to as the psychosomatic network. And I'll read you a couple things she says, because she puts it quite well. She says, "The broad view of the unified body-mind that emerges is a vision not only of mind-body interactions, but of dynamical mind-body unity, a multidimensional entity guided by emotions and their biochemical substrates, vibrating with intelligence and purpose without functional boundaries inside the human organism." And she goes on to say that hopelessness or joy have specific energetic and molecular correlates. The organismic experiences of such states cannot be reduced to either level, but appears to be translated on both levels simultaneously and indivisibly. So she's a big proponent of the mind-body connection. She also poses a very interesting question at the end of her paper. She says, at what level of the body-mind system can we identify the interpolation of awareness? Is this system susceptible to conscious intervention? And what we would say in Vipassana is sensation is the point at which we interpolate our awareness. It's the process by which we can capture and observe this phenomena going all the time and dispel this delusion that we want to hang on to of things as static and unchanging. There are many other levels in the sciences about the mind-body connection. Probably the most obvious one is the endocrine system. Many of you may be familiar with the fight-or-flight reaction, and when you're terrified, you liberate all kinds of hormones and chemicals that put your body into a very, ready state so that you can fight off a predator or respond appropriately to a threat of some kind. And certainly, if you're very anxious or in a kind of a fight-or-flight mode, that it has a very physical sensation that goes with it. Your gut's in a twist, and your heart's pounding, and you're sweating, etc. So that's a very obvious example. And then there's a huge body of literature on psychoneuroimmunology. I just remember Joan Borisenko was at a conference I went to last year. She's quite a famous woman who is a psychoneuroimmunologist, which is all about the connections between the mind and the nervous system and the immune system. And somebody in a lay audience that had asked her to speak introduced her as a psychic numerologist. I think she decided she'd missed her calling at that point. So anyway, there's lots of literature to show that various mental states, everything, just tons of things like bereavement, exam stress, being separated from loved ones, all kinds of different states of stress, including animal studies where they're being cruelly shocked and so on, that this affects the immune system at a very cellular level. So it's a very direct link between mind and body. Also, the placebo effect is something that you're all familiar with. This is an obvious example of a mind-body connection. And very interesting, a group of researchers did what they call a meta-analysis, where they essentially take a large body of papers and try to congeal them into one salient, what's the trend essentially in all of these studies. And they found that if they broke it down, they could attribute, when they compared an experimental drug with a fake drug, a placebo, that the placebo accounted for 76% of the patient's response. And some studies have found that it's even more. So powerful evidence for the mind-body connection. Another thing that's important about sensation that we've already touched on is because sensation is so tangible and concrete, much more so than trying to get into an abstract thought or imagine something, it's easy to maintain your awareness with something so physical, and it's also easier to develop objectivity about it. It's a little easier to distance yourself and be able to observe this going on, this process that's very physical, and develop that equanimity, that ability to be non-judging and not-evaluating. So it makes accessible that which is normally quite elusive. And again, I'm certainly not aware of any evidence in the sciences to support the fact that we can develop sensation at the level of subtlety that we do in Vipassana. So another interesting area to explore. And there's a threshold table, figure 2 actually, that talks about various sensory thresholds, levels at which you can start to feel sensation. And of course they're including vision and hearing, but if you look at touch, a bee's wing is the sensory threshold. And with Vipassana, it's interesting to note that we seem to go much beyond that and be able to perceive this oscillating, vibrating quality of our mind-matter structure. And probably one of the really important points about sensation, that's the 6th reason that it's so important in Vipassana, is that it's a bridge to the unconscious mind. And one of the problems we have with all of the suffering that we undergo is so much of what goes on is beyond our conscious awareness. We can't access it. And sensation is a bridge to the unconscious. It's kind of the missing link that helps us link up with those processes so that we can do something about them. If we can't perceive it, there's no way we can change it. Again, it'd be interesting to look at, haven't seen any discussion about this, but it would be interesting to look at sensation as a point where unconscious impulses are formed, and we're going to explore a little bit some psychology literature that talks about how unconscious we all are in our day-to-day existence. I was at an addiction seminar last year, and one of the clinical psychologists there said that 85% of our behavior is compulsive. Now, what did he mean by that? He meant that we don't seem to have direct control. We like to think that we make conscious decisions about things. We weigh the pros and cons about events, and we make decisions and we control our own behavior. But many different research studies have shown that a lot of our behavior is automatic and beyond our conscious awareness, and sometimes beyond our conscious control. One paper in the July 1999 issue of American Psychologist was entitled "The Unbearable Automaticity of Being." That was great. And they talk about how the conscious self plays a causal role in our responses only about 5% of the time. Now, they also talk about how our evaluations and our judgments are beyond our conscious awareness. We judge whether something is good or bad and act on that without even being aware that that process is going on. And one fellow summed it up well. He said that preferences need no inferences. We don't have to figure it out. It just happens automatically. They've done some experiments where they took subjects and primed them, what they call primed them with words. Like they would pick a theme like rudeness or politeness or aggressiveness. And they said that this was just a language experiment, and they would give them all these words having to do with rudeness and so on. And then later on, they would say, oh, now we're doing another experiment that's not related. And they would get people to engage in conversations, and these people would display much ruder behavior than the people who hadn't been primed with all these rude or aggressive words. And they had absolutely no awareness whatsoever that that's what was going on, but it's very consistent. There are many, many experiments that show this relationship. One particularly interesting story that's kind of an extreme version of this. Some neurological disorders can give you a window of insight into this phenomenon. One psychologist talks about alien hand syndrome. There was a patient with what they call alien hand syndrome. What is that? Well, I think that how they describe it will make it clear. It says, her hand acted autonomously, sometimes at cross purposes with intention. Her left hand would tenaciously grope and grasp at any nearby object, pick and pull at her clothes, and even grasp her throat during sleep. She slept with the arm tied to prevent nocturnal misbehavior. She never denied that her left arm and hand belonged to her, although she did refer to it as though it were an autonomous entity. Have any of you had this experience? I have. I find inexplicably and without my permission that often my foot finds my way into my mouth. And the point being that often we do things long before we're ever aware of them. So I'm going to give you, I'm questioning this quote. I like this quote by William James. I think I'll read it to you. In 1890, he wrote, "The whole sting and excitement of our voluntary life depends on our sense that in it things are really being decided from one moment to another, and that it is not the dull rattling off of a chain that was forged innumerable ages ago." And the psychologists that quoted him respond, "Psychology has shown that behavior is caused by mechanisms, the rattling off of genetic, unconscious, neural, cognitive, emotional, social, and yet other chains that lead, dully or not, to the things people do." So there's a little figure here again. At the bottom of the second page, figure 17 and 18, that demonstrates a couple of these principles. Figure 17 is a little picture I pulled out of a book called Elemental Mind, that really the point it's demonstrating is that they've, through experiments, deduced the speed of unconscious versus conscious information processing, and that unconscious data rates outnumber the conscious data rates by about 1 trillion. So there's a lot going on beyond our awareness, and the cognitive, conscious awareness barely scratches the surface of what's going on. Then figure 18 is a model that the psychologists in one paper in that related series of The Unbearable Automaticity of Being proposed. And it's very interesting to compare this to the model in Vipassana. In figure 18, they say that what's interesting is we have the concept of willing in action at times, but they've done an interesting experiment with resting potentials where they'll measure these electrical potentials across the scalp, and they'll ask people to just make a decision at any given time to move their index finger. And they'll ask the people to tell them exactly when they've made the decision to move their index finger. And what they found was that the resting potential indicated that the decision had already been made significantly before that person said that they decided to move their finger. So they said, so why do we get the impression? Where do we get this idea that we're willing something? And they said that unconscious cause of action, as we see in the figure, goes directly into action, or at least we're unaware of the mechanisms that go through that. That unconscious impulse also translates into thoughts that ultimately become conscious. But what's interesting is that our thoughts about the action are not what caused the action. And this is what they've concluded from all these experiments that they've done. So that our experience of will is somehow spurious, so to speak, to what we're actually doing. Now, obviously, there is a role for conscious decisions. We make conscious decisions and we act in a concerted way to achieve goals. They're not saying that there's no role for that. What they're saying is that it's shocking and somewhat alarming to discover how much of what we do is not conscious. Now, if we look at figure 19 and 20, figure 20 first, actually, it's kind of a simplified psychological model that an object in the outside world comes in contact through our senses, something we see, something we hear. And immediately, from what these psychologists are saying, we evaluate it, good, bad, indifferent, and then that and whatever else goes along with that evaluation, and that leads directly to some kind of response or reaction. And what Vipassana is saying, if you look at figure 19, is that we can introduce something here that intercepts that chain to make it conscious, so we can make some conscious choices to exercise the free will that we're all capable of. Sensation comes between evaluation and response. So something comes in contact with our awareness, we make an evaluation about it, it becomes sensation. Something we associate with pleasant things becomes pleasant sensation. Something we associate with unpleasant things becomes an unpleasant sensation. And by learning not to react to that and just observe in a non-judging way, then we can be in a position to stand back and say, okay, what do I want to do? Instead of just blindly reacting like a little animal. So let's talk a little bit about what does this mean for the individual? Now, how does this help me as a person? Well, again, there's no rigorous scientific data to prove this. There's lots and lots of anecdotal evidence. I'm sure that many of the meditators here would be happy to tell you their story about how it's helped them. People talk about decreased fear and more courage, being more compassionate, more sensitive, clearer-minded. One very specific benefit that one student reported was she said she always had this wise guy in her head that was making all these continual judgments and sarcastic remarks about herself and everybody else. It was a continual dialogue in her head all the time that she wasn't even really aware was going on until she did Vipassana. And after a course was over, she came along and said, no more wise guy. It's gone. Forever. The wise guy went right out of her head. There's some literature on happiness and psychology that the psychologists in a particular series of papers I read about happiness feel that it's very rudimentary, in the very rudimentary stages, but that certainly there are qualities that are associated with people having a general sense of well-being, and they list off a whole series of virtues, like hope and optimism, capacity for love and connection with others, courage, perseverance, wisdom, including things that are beneficial for others, like responsibility, altruism, tolerance, etc. And certainly Vipassana, anyone who's done Vipassana can tell you that those kinds of qualities become more prominent as they practice. Another area of psychology that's relevant is resilience and coping. And there's lots we could go into about this, but basically there are certain qualities that act as buffers against suffering. And Democritus and Epictetus are quoted in one of these papers as saying a very simple thing that many people are aware of, that it's not what happens to people that makes them happy or unhappy, it's how they interpret that determines their happiness. And certainly Vipassana would very much agree with that, and that it's all about free will and making conscious choices and often seeing change and something stressful as an opportunity for growth. Now, how do these changes manifest at a social level, at the collective level? And it has an obvious effect that if we become happier and develop all these good qualities, that manifests in our behavior towards other people. And it's also interesting to go back to the energetic, the matter, energy aspect of ourselves as human beings, and speculate that because of the frequency characteristic of matter, because of its electromagnetic component, that, again, it's quite possible that we connect with other people at the level of waves and frequencies, and that, I'm sure you've all met people that you can just resonate with. There are certain people that it just feels like you just fall into a slot and there's a certain resonance. And somebody just told me about a general theory of love. It's a book by 3 psychiatrists who talk about limbic resonance. And the limbic area of the brain is responsible for emotion and so on, to put it very simply. And maybe one of you's read the book and can tell us more about it. So it also has wide-reaching effects on the world and the environment. And just a quick quote by the Buddha. He says, "The world is led by the mind. It is dragged hither and thither by the mind." Paper on morality that was kind of interesting. The writer talks about enlightened self-interest. And the idea being very much similar to Vipassana, that if we take care of what harms and hurts ourselves, then automatically, if we develop a more wholesome attitude and more wholesome behavior, that we benefit and others benefit. What's harmful to others is harmful to me, and vice versa. And I remember a student who was actually somewhat wistful about losing one of her qualities, which was that of being able to lie. She said that, I used to be able to lie. I was such a good liar, really good liar. She said, now the results of lying are so immediate and unpleasant, I can't do it anymore. It feels horrible on my body. She kind of shook her head and said, what a waste of talent. Oh, it's a double-edged sword. Truth hurts sometimes. Some data we have around the social benefits of Vipassana is in the jail courses. Many of you probably just saw Changing from Inside. And they started in Tihar Jail in Delhi in 93, and as you know, just started in North Rehabilitation Facility a couple of years ago. And they have some data as of June of this year on recidivism rates, the rates at which people reoffend over the last 2 years. And they found that overall recidivism has dropped from 75% to 41% in those people that have taken courses. Now, this is all very, this isn't a rigorously designed study, and the number of students is very small. It's about 80 students. And another thing that might be a little deceiving about it is that all the people who took courses aren't out of jail yet, so you can't recidivate if you're not out of jail. So the number is a little artificially low, but they are doing 5 outcome studies now with 4 other programs as well to look at recidivism rates, and the Vipassana courses by far have the most promising statistics. There's also the possibility that Alan Marlette, who's a well-known addictions expert at the University of Washington, they're hoping to get funded to do a much more in-depth study of the effects of Vipassana on jail residents. And there's lots and lots of anecdotal evidence about businesses. In India, there are so many businesses that have deeply incorporated Vipassana into their operations, and lots of anecdotal support for everything from improved interpersonal relations to increased profits. In business, you've always got to take account of profits. And children's courses are another area where there's lots of reported benefits. Teachers, given questionnaires, will talk about how children are less disruptive, they're happier, they're getting along better with others, etc., and they're able to concentrate better. Now, let's talk about the application to the healthcare profession, since that's obviously relevant to a number of you here. How many healthcare professionals are there here? There's quite a few, maybe about guessing around 50 or something. So I'll talk a little bit about how Vipassana's helped me, how I found its application really useful in the trenches, so to speak. One of the things I've noticed is that I've become a lot less reactive and tense in the day-to-day practice. And not that I'm always floating on a cloud of equanimity by any means, but I'm certainly a lot more aware when I'm generating tension. And the hustle and pressure that's inherent in so many jobs, and being on call for long hours and so on, you get kind of worn down. Vipassana helps diffuse some of that tension, when you're able just to try to work with it, even in little fits and starts. And there's also certainly many of you who work particularly, I think, with in psychotherapy or psychiatry, there's a tendency to pick up stuff. loosely speaking from people, however you want to define that when you're relating to another human being that's suffering so much, we all have those inherent tendencies ourselves. And so we start to kind of identify with that and resonate with it. Now that's very useful and very good and helpful from the point of view of empathy. And certainly being in touch with your sensations makes you much more aware of that. It can also, if you get caught up in it and start reacting to it yourself, that inherent tendency that's been awakened in yourself, it can get overwhelming. And, often we find that if we're working with people who are suffering a lot, we start to feel kind of drained. And Vipassana, because it gives you that ability to develop equanimity with that, it helps you work with that in a way that keeps it at a level where your sensitivity is maintained, but you're not allowing yourself to hook into your own tendency to identify with that. And again, we can talk about this idea of resonating with other people from the energy quality that we have, the frequency characteristics of matter. We can speculate that indeed we do connect with each other at a vibrational level. I find that it's really helpful when you're dealing with a difficult situation. I mean, a lot of us have, for example, confronted an angry patient. I mean, often people, when they're overwhelmed, will respond in different ways. And I've noticed that an angry patient can be very threatening, if you start to feel attacked or blamed. And Vipassana has very distinctly saved me from behaving in a rather destructive way a few times. The impulse, you can start to feel that the impulse is arising when somebody is angry and attacking you, or you perceive that they're attacking you. There's a very unpleasant sensation that goes with that. And I've noticed that on those occasions when I remember to come back to sensation, it's been very helpful in sidestepping my ego and watching that tide of anger rising to the surface in response, and help diffuse that. And it helps to see that this isn't about me. This has nothing to do with me. It's not personal. This is about this person's suffering, and it helps to focus in on what that patient needs and helps keep you from behaving in a way that you're going to regret later. And I think I could summarize it by saying it cools my head and warms my heart and helps me remember that the patient is not the enemy in those kinds of situations. Another aspect of Vipassana that's related is that I notice that through the practice of Vipassana, I get more into the habit of what I call whole body listening. And when a patient is in your office, I notice that if I remember to go into the mode of being aware of sensation, that I don't immediately go into what Carl Rudebeck talks about. I'm going to give you some quotes from him, but he talks about this biomedical reflex that we get into. Somebody presents and they start telling their story, and you're immediately into your own head and your own dialogue about, okay, what's the differential diagnosis? This person's complaining of belly pain, and you go through your little list, and what's the lab workup? And you're totally missing what's going on with the patient because you're busy trying to, you're so preoccupied with your own story. So what Vipassana does is it kind of short-circuits that and helps you get into this non-judging, very, very receptive mode and catch often very subtle nuances of what's really going on here. And any of you that have worked with patients know that often when people come into the office and they say they want their flu shot, or, they've just got a little pain in their, in their chest, there's something else really going on. And when you're in that receptive state, often you'll pick up something's not right here. This isn't what it's about. And that person with their flu shot, if you probe a little because you can sense something's not right here, they'll often tell you, well, my son is on drugs, and, they're often on the point of, despair. And it's often helped pick up what's the underlying thing, what's behind the words that this patient is telling you. And, the person who comes in with belly pain might be afraid they have cancer. And you're sitting there trying to figure out, why is this person so distressed with this minor pain that they have? And when you really find out what's going on, it makes you much more effective. So sensation is a very powerful basis for empathy. And I find that it's the single most powerful tool that I have in medicine. I'm going to give you some quotes from Karl Rudebeck, who wrote a beautiful paper called The Doctor, the Patient, and the Body. And he very much, I wonder, like Paul wonders about the fellow he was talking about, if this man has spontaneously discovered Vipassana. Because the whole theme of his paper is that the best way to connect with patients is through our shared experience of being in a body. And some other studies have shown when they put doctors in a room, and this is kind of scary because these doctors know they're being studied. You think they'd want to be on their best behavior. But they put them in a room with a patient and find that the average time before the doctor interrupts the patient when the patient is trying to tell their story is 15 seconds. So we could learn a lot about being a little more receptive. So he says, Karl Rudebeck calls this aspect of relating to the patient through your shared bodily experience as bodily empathy. And there's quite a long quote here that I think beautifully sums it up. He says, "The atoms and molecules have also circulated in nature through the ages before they found their ways into my body, and no one knows where they will be in 1 billion years. The body is the I, and at the same time it is a piece of nature subjected to the laws of causality. When ill, this fact becomes salient. It is quite frightening to look right into the eyes of my own bodiness. My vulnerabilities suddenly become very concrete. Much of that which occurs I have no influence over, and even more I am, on the whole, not aware of. Within the impersonal and implacable hides, as their uttermost consequence, the reality of my own death. The field of action of biomedicine is the body as nature. It touches the most intimate aspects of my life, but puts, at the same time, my identity within brackets. There is a draft of nothingness in the examination room, and the undressed patient freezes doubly." So he emphasizes that there's nothing more real or more important than what the patient wants to tell, and that the root of understanding through people, between people, is through the body. And we're in a unique position as healthcare professionals, for those of you that are in that profession. We're privileged. We have a privileged access to people when they're often at their most vulnerable and hence their most receptive. So Vipassana is a very powerful tool for connecting with people at a level that we can resonate and be very receptive to what they're suffering and be receptive to what they need. It can have a profound effect on your practice and in your life. So I'll come towards finishing up with just a few thoughts about evolution. I don't think we've studied the effects of Vipassana long enough to comment on how it will affect evolution. But I'd like to think that certainly Vipassana makes us much more attentive to what's going on around us and much more sympathetic and more connected to others in our environment. And perhaps evolution can almost become more conscious. In a way, it's been driven largely by unconscious things, how we react in these unconscious ways to the environment. And it would be interesting to speculate what might happen in terms of natural selection if we were more socially, individually, and environmentally conscious. And some people feel that by our very nature, our essential nature is to be compelled towards enlightenment, and that ultimately evolution is taking us in this direction. So I'm going to give you a couple of take-home messages to conclude the talk. To sum up, the first take-home messages, there are two. The first take-home message is that sensations are all important in Vipassana. They're the missing link to what's going on at the unconscious level, which is normally out of our control and out of our awareness. It's our connection with mind and body, and it makes the reality of impermanence apparent so that we can stop clinging to this delusion that we can achieve some kind of happy, static state. It'd be very interesting to study the role of sensation in all of this in the level of the sciences. The second take-home message is that Vipassana is, to me, is stunning in its simplicity and its comprehensiveness. And certainly, while we cannot, by any means, if I'm wearing my scientist hat, we can't see that Vipassana is a hard science. It's not a precise science. But certainly, as I believe Paul has said, that it's scientifically compatible. And again, to reflect on a very important scientific principle, that when you're trying to explain a set of phenomena, that you seek an explanation, the simplest explanation is almost always the best and the closest to the truth. Vipassana reduces all of these phenomena into a very, very simple explanation about how we're always reacting to sensations at the unconscious level, and that continually fuels this wheel of suffering. Vipassana puts us in touch with this continuing vibrational reality, and it has a very expansive potential. We can become very expansive and connected to other people through this reality and the world around us. And I find it quite a lovely paradox that it's by virtue of impermanence that we're able to connect more fully with other people, that we can resonate with others more fully. And actually, Lucia Major, who is the administrator at NERF, has a lovely statement about Vipassana. She says, "We become less substance and more essence." You asked to comment on the philosophy of science and comment on pseudoscience.
Yeah.
And, well, what the exercise we're doing today is obviously, the philosophy of science, I can't give you a comprehensive, dissertation on that, but certainly science is about making objective observations about data in the real world and drawing conclusions from that, rather than going in there with your preconceived notions and trying to find pieces of data that happen to fit with that and ignoring all the rest. That much I can say. Certainly, pseudoscience, you could define pseudoscience in a lot of ways. One of them is doing just that, making up your data to sort of suit your ideas. And, all scientists recognize that certainly when we're not highly trained, in Vipassana would be my meditator bias, we're all biased. All of our preconceived notions about the world tend to distort the truth. We get partial truths, both in just our day-to-day functioning with other people and in the sciences. I think what's the beauty of Vipassana is that, yes, we're making a lot of assumptions in Vipassana that really the only way to explore this for yourself is through the direct experience. And I think that's what's something unique about Vipassana, if you consider it in the spirit of scientific inquiry, is how direct these observations are. You are the subject and the object of study, and you're very close to it. And some people would say, well, that directness and that closeness is so replete with bias that you couldn't possibly develop any objectivity. But ultimately, when people do Vipassana, their personal experience, call it subjective, if you will, it doesn't really matter. And I think probably, I don't want to set you up, Peter, but he might talk a little more about the artificial distinction between subjective and objective. And certainly when we're in Vipassana, that becomes blurred. Pseudoscience, well, again, we could say that this whole talk was pseudoscience, that we're speculating about some general principles in the sciences, which, for all I know, they found out are totally wrong, and that we're trying to relate those to basic principles or assumptions in Vipassana. But it's really just an exercise because for some of us with an intellectual or a cognitive bent, it makes it more coherent. It somehow makes it more sense to us and gives kind of a motivational edge. I find it helpful myself when I'm trudging through my body and kind of saying, why am I doing this again? Oh yeah, kalapas. And I can kind of go through it, and I can use the intellect as a way of motivating myself and saying, yes, this makes sense, this is why I'm doing it. Whether or not these things are true and these things are truly compatible with this scientific finding or that principle, who knows? But experience, we're talking about happiness here. The whole point of Vipassana is to become a happier, better person. Do you want a research scientist to tell you if you're happier, or do you want to decide that for yourself? So that's the point of Vipassana, really. This is all a big digression, all this stuff about science. The question is around the effects. You're basically talking about something that we think has a psychosomatic component. Is that a fair way to paraphrase? So talking about illnesses like irritable bowel syndrome, that in medicine we tend to, there's kind of a divided feeling. Some people feel it's purely psychosomatic. In other words, it's caused by people's anxiety or their underlying unconscious conflict, some Freudian thing or something. And other people feel it has a purely physical basis that we don't just understand yet, and everything in between. I can't say that, certainly, again, at an anecdotal level, there are many people who have problems like this. Things like migraines are very a common problem among people that many physicians feel have a psychosomatic basis, and many patients will tell you, when they're stressed, it's all psychosomatic. My migraines are triggered. Many people report that their migraines are better or gone after 1, 2, 3 or more courses. Irritable bowel, well, I can't say I've come across enough of a population in volunteering in Vipassana where I've been able to have a little, sample with the irritable bowel to comment specifically, but certainly many people respond that, in fact, I can think of one student right off the top of my head that I don't think she had the label of irritable bowel, but certainly she had her gut would just really act up with the slightest stress, and she's certainly reported that it's much less so since doing Vipassana. Mm-hmm. But there's an important point to make here, and that is that certainly many of these psychosomatic illnesses are created or worsened or exacerbated by certain mental states or this negativity that goes on, this reactive tension we generate. So there's a plethora of people that will tell you that their physical problems are better with Vipassana. But the important thing is that Vipassana is much more than that, and like Paul Fleischman said, it's a path. We will always be subject to some physical ailment or another. We are subject to aging and decay and death. We can't avoid those things. And while Vipassana may well have a byproduct on the sideline, it so happens that when you stop being so tense and reactive that your migraine or your irritable bowel goes away, that's not the goal. The goal is enlightenment. And that's what's going to take you out of your suffering. As long as we keep responding to these physical problems in a reactive way, we're prisoners of that. So we need to learn how to respond to any suffering that comes along, which we will all be subject to as long as we are in a physical body. That takes you much beyond any aspect of physical healing. The question is about if you want to study Vipassana at a scientific level, there are so many levels to start, as we went through, everything from physics up through to biology and psychology, etc. And this woman is very correctly pointing out that this, in a way, this is partial truth. We're only looking at it from one very narrow angle, and how do we go about being more comprehensive and complete if we want to investigate Vipassana scientifically? Well, there's some discussion in the literature about psychophysiology and how to approach things at multiple levels, and how simply, if we want to look at it, if we were a scientist and we wanted to investigate Vipassana scientifically, you'd ideally, I suppose, get a team of scientists from different disciplines together and look at it from as many angles as possible. And the interesting thing here is that it really illuminates the whole notion in Vipassana that we see things from all angles. And in science, the reality is it's so much less direct. And again, I'm speaking as a meditator now, not as a person with a background in science. But again, my personal experience, and many people will corroborate this, is that there is nothing so direct and so complete in terms of approaching things from many levels and many angles as doing the practice of Vipassana. And we can, pontificate and speculate and, posture about, the scientific implications and how we're going to study this scientifically. And that's worthwhile endeavor. But it pales in comparison to the level of understanding that you get when you do something experientially, something so fundamentally experiential, which is at the level of sensation, your own observation. The question is around how using people's language, kind of like when you're talking to other people about Vipassana, helping them relate to it if they are particularly of a scientific bent. How would you... Yes. So, basically, I mean, you can it's helpful to use people's language and relate to people on a level intellectually that they relate to. And I would say that if you're trying to use scientific examples, again, it's important to emphasize that the experience is really where it's at. That's the most, again, from a meditator's perspective, that's the most scientific study that you can do. But you would try to just choose some examples that are very speculative, like we talked about today, that you think that they could particularly relate to. The bottom line is many people have had the experience of going to Vipassana courses where the person who recommended it hasn't told them anything. They come out saying, "Oh, it's the most wonderful thing. It's fabulous. You've got to try it." And the person goes, "Great." And they go there and they get pain and they're, uncover all these horrible, miserable things. And they're like, "What is this? I mean, this isn't a bliss out, My friend was beaming when she came out, obviously. Her reality is different than mine." And the bottom line is you got to experience it. The proof is in the pudding. So all of these things may help people in understanding, but it's also important for them to understand that there's no substitute for experience. I'm not party to what happens to people after they die. I'm certainly party to the process of dying. The question, let me rephrase it, has to do with this concept of the process of continual becoming, that is this process of change, and becoming, and how conscious, it's one of the aspects of theory of Vipassana, how consciousness drives the flow of life in this continual, chain of reactions one after another, and how at the end of life, that the idea that at the end of life we don't really end, but it's not that we're reincarnated and that there's some permanent soul or entity, but that there's this process of consciousness itself drives to the next life. Well, it is a metaphysical question, and like I said, I can't observe what happens to people after death, but one comment I can make that's relevant is, as one person said to me, it has to be okay if we only have one life. In the context of Vipassana has to benefit us here and now. And if we're waiting around till we die to get the benefit, I don't think it's worth doing. So I can't wait that long. I'm more into instant gratification. So in any case, but that is relevant in terms of the end of life, in that yes, it has to be okay if there's only one life, because that's all we know. We can't prove that anything happens beyond that. But certainly I've been around many people when they're dying, and I've been struck and moved by how people's capacity to rise to a level that they maybe you wouldn't expect them to be able to do based on their life and their behavior. Often people at the time of death, some people, even in very distressed conditions of dying, it's very apparent that sometimes it happens at varying times previous to the point of death, but it's very clear to me that many, many people somehow reach a level, I don't know what they're doing, if they somehow slip into a more, equanimous mode or what's happening, but it's clear they become very peaceful. There's a sense that the struggle is stopped and that they're no longer resisting and that they're just kind of flowing with it. I'd like to think that somehow at some level they might even be tuning in to this reality. Just they suddenly give up and say, okay, I'm impermanent. Let's just go with it. and that's purely my impression, and that's all. The second question was about meditators who have taken up Vipassana and then at some point drop out. And, is there a common denominator between those people? I can't say that I'm aware of any studies that anybody's done about that. And it would be interesting to ask those people. But like anything else, meditation is a skill. Vipassana in particular is very rigorous. Anybody who's done a 10-day course, it's about facing the truth. It's about facing reality, and the truth hurts sometimes. And it's also a very demanding discipline in many ways. And sometimes people explore a number of different ways of dealing with exploring their inner world, different types of meditation or different ways of trying to improve themselves. And they may try Vipassana and try a number of things, and they just find something else that suits them better. Or sometimes it's probably has something to do with how it takes a certain level of commitment. And it's like any discipline or practice, that it requires continued motivation, perseverance, and that's what we're all working on. And sometimes people adopt some other method, or they just find Vipassana kind of difficult. There are a lot of questions in there. I think the first one has to do with, again, the comment around physical. If the body is just a reflection of the mind, then physical healing automatically goes with Vipassana, and that we shouldn't try to make such an artificial distinction between physical healing and what we're doing in Vipassana. And I think the point is not that we're trying to divide mind and body. Obviously we're not. The whole concept of Vipassana is unifying and integrating mind and body. The point there is simply that, yes, naturally, because mind and body are so closely linked, many of these psychosomatic phenomena, these physical phenomena that manifest as a result of mental processes or mental states, that they will be healed sometimes, to varying degrees, because we've cleaned up our act mentally. That's fine, that's good. The issue is not that that's not okay. The issue that's not okay is when we start going after Vipassana as a way of healing physical problems, because it completely misses the point. Vipassana is about equanimity first and foremost. It's about accepting the reality of what is. Not that you shouldn't go and get some physical therapy if you've got a health problem, certainly not. You should be doing everything you can to maintain your health. I mean, the body is the means, it's your vehicle for enlightenment. If you don't have a body, you can't do Vipassana. So it's very important that you take care of your physical health, but if physical health becomes your goal in Vipassana, you cannot practice equanimity, because by definition you are not equanimous. You're craving after some. That's the key point in that whole process. So there's nothing wrong with pursuing, various therapies that will heal your body. It's just that is not Vipassana. They have different goals. The question is around if one person's doing Vipassana or a number of people are doing Vipassana, can it have an impact on the rest of the population in some way, such that it makes it easier for them somehow to get into that mode of coming out of their suffering? Does that kind of
basically
paraphrase?
To impact the ability of people to pursue happiness.
Okay, to impact the ability of people to pursue happiness. It's a very good question. Ultimately, everybody has to do their own work. It's very direct that way. There's no way in this tradition to conceptualize that one person meditating can liberate somebody else, in the absolute sense. There's no way that if I meditate really hard that, I'm going to be able to, or even the Buddha, he said himself, if somebody cannot do the practice, if they don't do their own experiential grunt work, then he can't enlighten them. There's nothing to be done. We all have to do our own work. All of that stuff is within ourselves, and we have to work through it little by little, every part of it. However, there's another side to that, and that is this collective influence is very real. And the effect certainly that it can have if I meditate, and lots of meditators here would tell stories about how their relationships in their family improved, that maybe even someone who was very resistant to Vipassana at first, over months or years or even decades, observes that, my sister or my son or whatever has been doing Vipassana for a long time, and at first I thought he was kind of brainwashed and I didn't see much change or whatever else, but that over time it's like there are changes. This person, because it's manifesting in their behavior. And maybe even again at that energetic level, the 100th monkey thing that you referred to, maybe that's at the level even of energy and vibration and resonating with someone that somehow you get aligned with people. It's my perception that often if you're using Vipassana in your relationships with people, that you can get aligned with them and they can get aligned with you, such that there's something that moves them about who you are and what you've learned and how that's manifesting in your life, and that people kind of look at that and go, there's something, they connect with it somehow. It's contagious in that sense. Now that doesn't mean that they get, that somehow has a crossover effect and they'll get enlightened from it. But it certainly means that they'll be inspired. They'll connect with those better qualities, those virtues in themselves, that it will tend to help them get in touch with their own good qualities, and it also may make them very attracted to do their own work, which is ultimately what everybody has to do. 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 Ultimately what